Good afternoon, class. This is John Van Slyke. I'm checking in as I said that I might. I wanted to just put some finishing touches on our conversation that we had in class today, and most of you were there, and as part of being there, you understand that our topic today was a continuation of the issue of race and racism as they emerge really with considerably greater intensity during the colonial and imperial projects of many European nation states from roughly 1500 to the present. So essentially the last 500 years or so of Western world history. And we pivoted from yesterday's conversation or yesterday's documentary where we're looking at sort of the clearer, maybe more straightforward examples of racism that maybe a lot of people think of when they think about terms like race and racism, of the slavery of African Americans and the institution of slavery, the role it played in the economy, similarly the different treatment that Native Americans received, particularly in the early decades of the Europeans' arrival. But today we were shifting with the help of our essay that was called Imperialism, Eugenics, and the Holocaust. We were looking at different ways in which race has been applied that sort of continue to develop our sense of, contribute to issues of inequality. Only this time it's race being applied perhaps not in quite as dramatic or obvious ways, but still being used by the dominant culture at hand to explain or try to quote-unquote other different groups of people. And so we talked about this. We used the phrase internal racisms. We talked about how the industrial era sort of created this period of time where even white European immigrants who were coming to places like the United States, or maybe lower class British citizens, how they were being treated differentially in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. And so these photos here of the Chicago stockyards that might call to mind Upton Sinclair and his famous work of muckraking journalism called The Jungle. It was an attempt to sort of diminish and portray even the white immigrants that were a vital part of this industrial process, or the industrial processes that were taking place during the 1800s, to treat them as an other and to portray them as somehow deficient, and to sort of establish these different gradations between the different people who lived within a society. And then we also continued and we spoke about othering and the indirect rule, which was particularly early on in the British process, colonial process of ruling India, as well as other parts of the British Empire. The use of indirect rule, what that meant, how ornamentalism was an attempt to use the native leadership or the native aristocracy of a given area and use those people to sort of maintain control. I didn't really speak about this picture, but this is a picture of a sepoy, which was the name given to the Indian soldiers who fought on behalf of the British Empire. And there was a famous rebellion in 1857 known as the Sepoy Rebellion, when these British soldiers, who were Indian by origin, rose up and rebelled against their British colonizers. Okay, so this is kind of where we left off today, and we were talking a little bit about how British culture sort of later on in the industrial era, and now we can be talking, think 1860s, 70s, 80s. Once again, the notions of race are going to be somewhat flexibly revisited. And you can probably sense at this point that the term race has been employed in different ways at different times in history, but oftentimes to accomplish surprisingly similar objectives. We talked about how in 1867 the Reform Act in Great Britain, it was an act of Parliament that essentially expanded suffrage, or the right of the male vote in Great Britain, in a way that sort of allowed people of lower station within Great Britain to qualify for the privileges of, citizenship and become a more active and ruling part of the society. Part of the way we can explain this is that Britain is now engaged in its imperial project, where it is establishing bases in places like Africa and trying to lay claim to parts of China and other parts of Southeast Asia, Burma, so on and so forth. And by having a more consolidated support of all white, at this point it would have technically been white males, but just having all of the British white majority sort of playing from the same page, so to speak, it was thought to be an advantageous set of circumstances. And of course, by re-expanding or establishing race now in a way that was more color-oriented, that became more useful to the challenges at hand. Similarly, this was the time of the white man's burden, which was made famous in Rudyard Kipling's famous poem of the same name. And we talked in class about how this wasn't something that anyone, it was as if the British imperial project, and this was true of other European countries at that time, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, so on and so forth. They were essentially framing their presence in other parts of the world, like Africa, as a duty or an obligation that they owed to sort of less sophisticated and less evolved, quote-unquote, races of people. And the white man's burden was to lift them up. And of course, a closer examination, and it doesn't take much of a closer examination, reveals that very much of what was going on was European nation states were trying to help themselves to the natural resources and commodities of developing countries and developing world regions at that time. Incidentally, we'll be talking about this a lot more in our fourth unit when we talk about the democratic Congo. We talk about the Belgian presence in the Congo, and how even to this day the resource conflicts in that country are still having tremendous hardship on that country. And then social Darwinism was an effort to portray in pseudo-scientific terms what people were trying to suggest, what many Europeans were trying to suggest about race. And it's important to note that just a few decades before, Charles Darwin had published his famous academic work called The Origin of Species. And that was a fairly scientific book, but of course it spoke to the theory of natural selection, which Charles Darwin identified as the mechanism by which evolution happens within the animal world. Darwin's theory of natural selection had very little to do with the human species, so to speak. His subjects of study certainly weren't humans. And it certainly didn't have anything to do with race, because, of course, all humans, regardless of their quote-unquote race, are of the same genus and species, Homo sapiens. But the social Darwinists didn't let that stop them, and it became quite common in the late 1800s and early 1900s to portray some of the perceived differences between different quote-unquote races of people as being evidence of the social Darwinist claim of the survival of the fittest, that there are innate qualities to certain races that favor certain races over others. And of course, as you might recall, Jared Diamond, who we spent time with last week, of course he rejected this. He rejects this notion out of hand. The social Darwinists made quite a bit of they made quite a name for themselves by pursuing these kinds of ideas. So finally, this question: what were the primary concerns expressed by the social Darwinists and eugenicists? Eugenics is essentially the practice or the pseudoscience of attributing certain traits to certain groups of the human species based on this idea of quote-unquote race. So the Immigration Restriction League and organizations like this became pretty common toward the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And their fear was this idea that if you had different groups of people, different quote-unquote races, interbreeding, you would have society would suffer from a dilution of intelligence. So the suggestion here is that there are certain groups and the quote-unquote white race, and then these folks of the Immigration Restriction League would have also distinguished between different groups of whites and said, you know, there are certain nationalities that are smarter and others that are not so smart. And so the fear was that with all of this quote-unquote inbreeding, there would be a weakening of the intelligence, because when you are essentially interbreeding intelligent people and intelligent quote-unquote races with less intelligent races, you are ultimately undermining and degrading the overall intelligence of that formerly superior society. I know, hard to even explain that, actually, give words to that idea. And delusion of intelligence is closely tied to this notion of quote-unquote racial degeneration, that some accomplished and proud races would be effectively undermined by their coming in contact and interbreeding and creating new generations of mixed racial offspring. And then finally, we see the evidence. One dramatic piece of evidence here is the Immigration Act of 1924, which was an act of U.S. Congress, which set racial quotas for immigrants for a given year. And this act famously restricted the inflow of Chinese immigrants altogether. And then in a whole host of other, with regards to people of other nationalities, this act looked back at the census of 1890 and said that no more than 2% of the total number of people who existed in the United States in 1890 could be accepted as new immigrants. And this was consequential because in 1890 it had been a time, remember that's 34 years prior to this act, the year of 1890 was an effort to point to a time when very few immigrants from the quote-unquote less desirable parts of Europe were allowed. So the Immigration Act of 1924 was an effort to discourage the presence and the admission of certain groups of people into the United States at that time. Okay, so with that I'll stop, and thank you for your time.